December 17, 1939 in Kola, Finland. Soviet Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov crouched behind a fallen tree, trying to understand what was happening to his unit. In the past hour, 7 of his soldiers had been struck by sniper fire. 7 men, 7 shots, 7 casualties. No misses, no wasted ammunition. Just precise, lethal fire from somewhere in the snow-covered forest ahead. Volkov raised his binoculars to scan the tree line. Nothing. Just white snow, dark trees, and silence. He knew the sniper was out there. The trajectory of the shots proved it. But he couldn't see anything. No scope glint, no movement, no indication of where the shots were coming from. Then his radio operator slumped forward, struck by a bullet Volkov never heard fired. 8 casualties, still no indication of the sniper's position. Volkov made a decision that would be repeated by Soviet officers across the Kolar front over the next 3 months. He ordered his unit to retreat. Fighting an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't locate, and couldn't eliminate was suicide. What Lieutenant Volkov didn't know was that the sniper hunting his unit was a 34-year-old Finnish farmer who stood 5 feet 3 inches tall, weighed barely 150 pounds, and was using a rifle without a telescopic scope. His name was Simo Häyhä, and over the next 100 days of the Winter War, he would become the most effective sniper in military history, with approximately 505 confirmed kills, and the Soviet army would dedicate entire operations to eliminating this one man. Simo Häyhä was born on December 17, 1905, in the farming region of Rautjärvi in what was then part of the Russian Empire. His family were farmers, and Simo grew up doing farm work, hunting in the forests, and developing skills that would later prove militarily valuable without realizing it. Häyhä learned to shoot as a child, hunting game to supplement the family's food supply. Finland's environment demanded good marksmanship. Ammunition was expensive, game was wary, and winters were harsh. You learned to make every shot count or your family went hungry. By his teenage years, Häyhä was known locally as an exceptional shot, able to hit small targets at considerable distances in difficult conditions. When Finland gained independence from Russia in 1917, Finnish culture emphasized citizen readiness for national defense. Every Finnish man was expected to serve in the military and maintain proficiency afterward. Häyhä completed his mandatory military service in 1927, where instructors noted his marksmanship but otherwise considered him an unremarkable soldier, short, quiet, not particularly physically imposing. After military service, Häyhä returned to farming. He joined the White Guard, a Finnish voluntary militia organization that trained regularly for national defense. He participated in shooting competitions, where he consistently won or placed highly despite using basic equipment. While other competitors used expensive rifles with optical sights, Häyhä used a standard-issue Mosin Nagant M28 rifle with iron sights, the same rifle he'd used in military service. Why did Häyhä refuse to use a telescopic sight? His reasoning was practical. Scoped rifles require you to position your head higher to look through the scope, exposing more of your profile. Scopes can fog up in cold weather or produce a glint that reveals your position. Iron sights were simpler, more reliable, and allowed a lower shooting position. For Häyhä's purposes, shooting in Finnish winter conditions where concealment and reliability were paramount, iron sights were superior. This decision would prove crucial during the Winter War. On November 30, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. The Soviet reasoning was strategic. Finland's proximity to Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, and the Soviet Union's second-largest city made Soviet leadership nervous. They demanded territorial concessions from Finland. When Finland refused, Stalin ordered an invasion. The Soviet plan was simple. Overwhelming force would crush Finnish resistance in weeks. The Red Army deployed approximately 760,000 soldiers against Finland's army of roughly 300,000. Soviet forces had tanks, aircraft, and artillery in vastly superior numbers. Soviet commanders expected quick victory. They hadn't accounted for Finnish determination, knowledge of their own terrain, and soldiers like Simo Häyhä. Häyhä was mobilized with other reservists and assigned to the 6th Company, JR 34, Infantry Regiment 34, defending the Kola front. This sector was critical. If Soviet forces broke through at Kola, they could advance deep into Finland. The Finnish defensive line had to hold, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Häyhä was assigned as a sniper, a role he hadn't specifically trained for, but that suited his skills. His objective was simple: eliminate Soviet soldiers to slow their advance, create fear and uncertainty, and make every meter of Finnish territory as costly as possible for invaders. What happened next became the stuff of military legend and Soviet nightmare. Häyhä's typical operating procedure was methodical. He would move into position before dawn, often crawling through snow to reach a concealed spot with good sightlines. He carried his Mosin Nagant M28 rifle, ammunition, and minimal supplies. He wore all-white camouflage that made him nearly invisible against snow. Once in position, Häyhä would wait, sometimes for hours. He had farmers' patience, the ability to remain motionless for extended periods, watching for the right moment. When Soviet soldiers appeared in his sightlines, Häyhä would breathe steadily, wait for them to stop moving or present a clear target, and fire. One shot, one casualty. Häyhä almost never missed. His hit rate was astonishingly high. Soviet units reported being attacked by a sniper who seemed to never waste ammunition. This wasn't superhuman ability, it was discipline. Häyhä only fired when he was certain of the shot. If he wasn't certain, he didn't fire. This meant he sometimes let targets pass rather than risk revealing his position with a missed shot. After firing, Häyhä would often remain in position. Less experienced snipers would immediately relocate after shooting, but Häyhä understood that the enemy's initial response to sniper fire was to scan the area where they thought the shot came from. If the sniper had already moved, enemies might spot the movement. By remaining still, Häyhä often avoided detection even after firing multiple shots from the same position. He did have one technique that puzzled Soviet observers. Before firing, Häyhä would pack snow in front of his position. The purpose was to prevent snow from being kicked up by muzzle blast, which would reveal his location. It was a small detail, but attention to such details made Häyhä extraordinarily difficult to locate. The results were devastating for Soviet forces. Units advancing through the Kola sector began experiencing seemingly random casualties. Soldiers would be struck without warning. The shots seemed to come from nowhere. Surviving Soviet soldiers reported a pervasive sense of dread. Any movement, any exposure, could result in a bullet from an unseen shooter. Soviet commanders initially didn't understand what they were facing. Early reports attributed casualties to multiple Finnish snipers operating in the sector. But as the pattern continued, Soviet intelligence began realizing that a single sniper was responsible for an extraordinary number of casualties. How did they figure this out? Soviet units began comparing incident reports and casualty patterns. The sniper's effectiveness, the shooting patterns, the areas of operation, everything suggested one individual operating with remarkable consistency. Soviet intelligence even intercepted Finnish communications that referred to a particularly effective sniper in the Kola sector. The Soviet response escalated through several phases, each more desperate than the last. Initially, they deployed counter-snipers, Soviet snipers tasked with finding and eliminating Häyhä. This failed. Häyhä's concealment was too good, his patience too great. Soviet counter-snipers would search for him and become targets themselves. Häyhä eliminated several Soviet snipers who came looking for him. The Soviets then tried artillery strikes on areas where they thought Häyhä might be operating. They would bombard sections of forest based on where sniper fire had originated. This was expensive and largely ineffective. Häyhä would simply avoid the bombarded areas or had already moved before shells arrived. Growing more desperate, Soviet forces tried what military historians now consider the most extreme anti-sniper measure of the war. They called in artillery strikes on their own suspected positions just to possibly eliminate one Finnish sniper. Think about that. The Soviet military was willing to bombard areas their own troops might be in, based on the mere possibility that Häyhä was nearby. This tells us something important. The psychological impact of Häyhä's activities exceeded his direct military impact. Yes, he was eliminating numerous Soviet soldiers. But more significantly, he was making Soviet troops terrified to move, reducing their combat effectiveness and forcing Soviet commanders to make increasingly irrational decisions. By late December 1939, Soviet soldiers in the Kola sector had nicknamed the unseen sniper Belaya Smert, White Death. The name spread through Soviet units. Soldiers would whisper about the White Death, this ghostly Finnish sniper who appeared out of nowhere, struck with lethal precision, and vanished without trace. Finnish forces became aware of Häyhä's effectiveness and began providing him some support. Other Finnish soldiers would cover his movements, providing security while he moved into position. Finnish commanders would coordinate operations to take advantage of Soviet forces being pinned down by sniper fire. Häyhä was becoming a military asset that shaped operational planning. But here's something that Häyhä never discussed publicly, and that only emerged from interviews with fellow soldiers years later. He was deeply troubled by what he was doing. Häyhä was a devout Lutheran, a farmer who had never sought conflict. He was now eliminating human beings daily, Soviet soldiers who were following orders, who had families, who were individuals just like him. Fellow Finnish soldiers reported that Häyhä would pray before and after operations. He maintained a journal where he recorded not his kills, he hated that term, but his duties, marking each day's activities without celebration or pride. He refused to discuss his work casually, finding other soldiers' interest in his body count disturbing. This psychological dimension is often omitted from accounts that focus only on Häyhä's effectiveness. He was extraordinarily good at something he found morally difficult. He continued because he believed he was defending his country, but the personal cost was substantial. By January 1940, 2 months into the conflict, Häyhä had accumulated approximately 300 confirmed kills. Soviet commanders were receiving reports of casualties that seemed impossible for one sniper. Some refused to believe the reports, thinking Finnish propaganda was exaggerating. But frontline units knew the truth. The White Death was real and was decimating Soviet forces. Soviet forces tried a new tactic, large-scale attacks designed to overwhelm Finnish positions through sheer numbers. The logic was that even the most effective sniper couldn't stop hundreds of soldiers attacking simultaneously. The attacks were costly. Häyhä would eliminate soldiers during the approach, causing the attack formations to falter. Other Finnish defenders would then engage the disrupted formations. The attacks often failed with horrific Soviet casualties. One specific engagement illustrates Häyhä's impact. On January 22, 1940, Soviet forces launched an attack on Finnish positions at Kola with approximately 4,000 soldiers. Häyhä was positioned overlooking the main Soviet approach route. As the attack began, he engaged Soviet officers and unit leaders, soldiers identifiable by their positions and behavior. By eliminating leaders early in the attack, Häyhä created confusion and reduced the attack's coordination. Soviet soldiers continued advancing, but without the leadership necessary to maintain formation and respond to Finnish defensive tactics. The attack faltered and eventually retreated with heavy casualties. Häyhä had personally accounted for at least 25 Soviet casualties during this engagement, but his strategic impact, disrupting command and control, was even more significant. February 1940 brought the coldest weather of the winter. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Combat under these conditions was almost impossible. Weapons malfunctioned. Visibility was reduced by blowing snow. Soldiers suffered frostbite and exposure. Häyhä continued operating. He had grown up in Finnish winters and knew how to function in extreme cold. He understood how to maintain his rifle in sub-zero temperatures, how to prevent frostbite while remaining motionless for hours, how to move through deep snow without excessive effort. Soviet soldiers, many from warmer regions of the Soviet Union, struggled in these conditions. They were simultaneously fighting Finnish defenders and battling the environment. Häyhä became even more effective during this period because Soviet forces were less alert, more focused on survival than on tactical awareness. By late February 1940, Häyhä's confirmed kills exceeded 500. This number comes from Finnish military records that tracked confirmed sniper eliminations, kills witnessed by other Finnish soldiers or verified through battlefield observation. Häyhä himself never claimed a specific number, considering such accounting distasteful. The number 505 is now generally accepted as Häyhä's confirmed sniper kills during the Winter War. Some sources suggest his actual total was higher when including casualties inflicted with submachine gun during defensive actions, but the 505 figure refers specifically to sniper kills, individuals eliminated with rifle fire at distance. To put this in perspective, Häyhä achieved 505 confirmed kills in approximately 100 days of combat. That's an average of 5 per day every day for over 3 months. No sniper in military history has matched this effectiveness over a comparable period. Soviet desperation to eliminate Häyhä reached its peak in late February 1940. They knew the general area where he operated but couldn't pinpoint his positions. They deployed multiple counter-sniper teams simultaneously, hoping to either spot him or trap him through coordinated observation. On March 6, 1940, one of these Soviet efforts nearly succeeded. A Soviet counter-sniper spotted movement in the snow and fired an explosive round, a bullet designed to create maximum damage on impact. The round struck Häyhä in the face, specifically in his left jaw. The injury was catastrophic. The explosive round shattered Häyhä's jaw, destroyed much of the left side of his face, and should have been immediately fatal. Häyhä collapsed, unconscious and severely wounded. Fellow Finnish soldiers found him and assumed he was deceased. Then someone noticed he was still breathing. They evacuated him to a field hospital, though medical personnel initially believed he wouldn't survive. The injuries were too severe. Massive facial trauma, significant blood loss, possible brain damage from the impact. Häyhä remained unconscious for 11 days. Doctors performed emergency surgery to stabilize him, but doubted he would survive even if he regained consciousness. The injuries were simply too extensive. On March 13, 1940, Häyhä regained consciousness. The same day the Winter War ended, Finland and the Soviet Union signed a peace treaty. Häyhä woke to discover that Finland had survived, though at the cost of territorial concessions to the Soviet Union. The conflict he had fought so effectively was over. But Häyhä's ordeal wasn't over. His recovery would take years. The facial injuries required multiple reconstructive surgeries. He lost his left cheekbone and several teeth. His jaw had to be rebuilt using bone grafts. The surgeries were painful and only partially successful. Häyhä would have permanent facial deformities for the rest of his life. The psychological impact was also significant. Häyhä had spent months in a state of constant alertness, living with the awareness that any moment might bring a Soviet counter-sniper's bullet. The relief that the conflict had ended mixed with trauma from his experiences and the physical pain of his injuries. Finland recognized Häyhä's service immediately. He was promoted from corporal to second lieutenant, a battlefield promotion that skipped several ranks, highly unusual in Finnish military tradition. He received numerous medals and commendations. But Häyhä was uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to focus on recovery and eventually returning to farming. Here's what makes Häyhä's post-conflict life remarkable. He refused to be defined by his wartime service. Media wanted interviews, wanted him to discuss his tactics and his kill count. Häyhä declined most requests. He would acknowledge his service when asked, but wouldn't discuss specifics. He said once, "I did what was necessary to defend my country. I'm not proud of the numbers. "I'm grateful that Finland survived." Häyhä returned to farming in the area where he'd grown up. He lived quietly, avoided publicity, and rarely discussed the war. Those who knew him described him as gentle, kind, and deeply averse to conflict. The man who had been the most effective sniper in history wanted nothing more than to live peacefully and never fire a weapon again. The Soviet Union, interestingly, tried to suppress information about Häyhä. Soviet histories of the Winter War rarely mentioned him by name, and when they did, they downplayed his effectiveness. The Soviet narrative was that the Red Army had achieved a strategic victory in the Winter War, gaining territorial concessions from Finland. Acknowledging that a single Finnish farmer had inflicted massive casualties on Soviet forces undermined that narrative. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union's collapse, that Russian historians and veterans began openly discussing the Winter War more honestly. Some Russian veterans who had fought at Kola confirmed stories about the White Death, providing Soviet perspective on Häyhä's impact. One Russian veteran said in a 1990s interview, "We heard about the White Death constantly. No one wanted to advance at Kola because of him. The fear was overwhelming." As Häyhä aged, he became more willing to discuss his experiences, but always with reluctance and never with pride. In interviews from the 1990s and early 2000s, he emphasized several points consistently. First, he said his success wasn't about being a better soldier than others, but about being a farmer who knew Finnish terrain and winter conditions intimately. He had advantages Soviet soldiers didn't. Second, he emphasized that war was terrible and that the casualties he inflicted represented Soviet soldiers who had families and lives. He took no satisfaction in their losses. Third, he credited Finnish soldiers generally with defending the country, not wanting to be singled out as exceptional. Fourth, he said the real heroes were those who didn't survive the conflict. They had given everything while he had lived to see Finland remain independent. These weren't false modesty or scripted responses. Häyhä genuinely seemed uncomfortable with his effectiveness and the attention it brought. He had been extraordinarily good at something he wished he'd never had to do. Häyhä lived to age 96, passing away on April 1st, 2002. His long life after the conflict meant he saw Finland prosper as an independent nation, saw the Soviet Union collapse, and saw his story become known internationally. Near the end of his life, a journalist asked him how he had become such an effective sniper. Häyhä's response, practice. That one-word answer encapsulates Häyhä's personality. He didn't offer elaborate explanations or philosophizing. He had been good at shooting because he practiced. He had survived because he was careful. He had served because Finland needed defending. Simple answers to complex questions. But the simplicity was somewhat misleading. What Häyhä did required extraordinary discipline, patience, tactical intelligence, and psychological resilience. Operating alone in sub-zero conditions, knowing that dozens of enemy soldiers were specifically searching for him, maintaining concentration for hours at a time, making split-second decisions about when to fire and when to wait. These aren't simple skills. They require exceptional mental and physical capabilities. Modern military snipers study Häyhä's tactics. His preference for iron sights over scopes is still debated. Was it genuinely superior, or just what worked for him personally? His emphasis on concealment over mobility influences current doctrine about sniper positioning. His psychological discipline, firing only when certain, remaining in position after shooting, avoiding unnecessary risk, is taught as fundamental to sniper effectiveness. But there's one element of Häyhä's story that can't be taught or studied: his motivation. He wasn't fighting for ideology or glory. He was defending his homeland against invasion. That motivation produced a level of dedication and effectiveness that probably can't be replicated in other contexts. The Soviet forces that faced Häyhä at Kola ultimately failed to break through Finnish defenses, despite massive numerical advantages. The Winter War ended with Finland ceding some territory, but maintaining independence. The Soviet military leadership was embarrassed by their performance. They had expected to overwhelm Finland in weeks, and instead fought for over 3 months with humiliating casualties. One small Finnish farmer with a rifle and iron sights had become a symbol of Finnish resistance and Soviet frustration. The White Death represented Finnish determination, undersized, outgunned and seemingly overmatched, but absolutely refusing to quit. Häyhä's legacy in Finland is unique. He's celebrated as a national hero, but he never wanted that status. He wanted to be remembered as someone who did his duty when his country needed him, nothing more. Finnish military museums display his rifle and equipment, but always with context about the Winter War and the collective Finnish defense effort. There's a memorial to Häyhä near Kola, placed near where he operated during the Winter War. It's simple, a small marker with his name and dates of service. He reportedly didn't want a memorial at all, but Finnish veterans insisted. The compromise was something understated that acknowledged his service without glorifying violence. In Russia, acknowledgement of Häyhä has evolved. Soviet-era denial has been replaced by grudging respect from military historians who recognize his effectiveness regardless of which side he fought for. Some Russian military educators now use Häyhä as a case study in sniper tactics, separating his technical achievements from the political context of the Winter War. The 505 confirmed kills figure remains staggering. To understand the scale, most military snipers who are considered highly effective might achieve 20-50 confirmed kills over an entire career. Häyhä achieved 505 in roughly 100 days. The closest comparison is Soviet sniper Lyudmila Pavlichenko's 309 confirmed kills during World War II, but that was over approximately 2 years of combat. Häyhä's rate of effectiveness in such a short period remains unmatched. What's important to understand is that these numbers represent human beings. Soviet soldiers who were following orders, who were conscripted into military service, who had families waiting for them. Häyhä never forgot this. The numbers that make his story remarkable also represented the aspect of his service he found most troubling. This moral complexity is often overlooked in accounts that celebrate Häyhä as a military hero. He was effective and he was troubled by his effectiveness. He defended his country and he paid a psychological price for doing so. He survived physically, but carried emotional and moral weight for the rest of his life. Simo Häyhä, the White Death, the most effective sniper in military history, was a short Finnish farmer who wanted nothing more than to tend his land in peace. When his country was invaded, he used skills learned hunting game to defend Finnish independence. He was extraordinarily good at something he never wanted to do. He survived a wound that should have been fatal and lived nearly 6 more decades, always maintaining that he'd simply done what was necessary and that others deserved recognition more than he did. Remember Simo Häyhä, not as a killing machine or superhuman warrior, but as a complex individual who found himself in impossible circumstances and responded with effectiveness that came at personal cost. Remember that courage and skill can coexist with moral struggle. Remember that heroes are often deeply uncomfortable with being called heroes. And remember that 505 confirmed kills, while a remarkable military statistic, represented 505 individual human beings whose lives ended in the frozen forests of Kola at the hands of a man who would spend the rest of his life wishing the conflict had never happened.